Amen. Hey, if you have your Bibles with you today, you can turn to the book of John in chapter 21. Going to be a couple minutes before we get there, but that's going to be by far our main text today. So John chapter 21, and if you want to follow along, that's where you can turn in your paper Bible, or if you got a digital copy with you, that's fine too. And we're in the very first week of a new series called Influencer. So we're going to be talking all throughout the next 5 weeks or so about the influence that we can have as individuals. Now, I realize every week we've got some folks here who are followers of Jesus, you're Christians. We have some folks who are checking out faith. You're not sure where you stand, you're not sure what you think about Jesus yet. Really happy, regardless of where you fall in that spectrum, to have you here today, and excited that you are exploring faith, because we think that faith is worth exploring. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, you really are a steward of influence for the sake of the kingdom. That's the kind of influence that Jesus asked us to steward. But even if you're not a follower of Jesus, you do have influence over people in your life, and you probably want to influence them well. A lot of times when we think about influence today, we think of social media influencers, people who have garnered, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of followers on Twitter or on Instagram, and they've leveraged that influence to sell t-shirts. So that's a lot of times what we think of when we think of influencers, or soda, or whatever it might be, right? But that's not maybe the best way to think about influence. The reality is, regardless of how many social media followers you might have, you have influence over other people in your life. It could be your family, it could be your coworkers, it could be your friends, could be your classmates. You have influence over a group of people. And whether you're a good influence on those people or a bad influence will very much depend on much of what we talk about today and in the following weeks. But we want to be a group of people who is influencing the world well in positive ways. And because we believe that Jesus is our Lord, we want to be influencing the world in Christ-like ways. So I think the next several weeks will be helpful. But today we're really going to talk about self-leadership. How we lead ourselves, because I think this is the foundational starting place before we talk about how we can influence others. If we're not leading ourselves well, we won't influence or lead other people well either. A few years ago, I attended a leadership conference, and one of the speakers started the conference off with a sentence, a confession, really. Here was the confession that he made. He said, "I have participated in every bad decision I have ever made." And I thought, oh, that's a shame for him. And then I thought, oh, wait, crud, I've participated in every bad decision I have ever made. So really dumb education decisions I made, yep, I was responsible for that. Really bad decisions I made in relationships or friendships, that was all me. Stupid decisions I made when I got married, and early on in our marriage, we had no money, and I was like, we should buy lots of scuba gear. I was the mastermind of that decision, right? I was there for all that stuff as we kept putting things on credit cards. Bad decisions I made in my marriage, not the person I married, and I did well there, but like bad decisions I made as a husband or as a father, I was there for all of those. I made those decisions. Even kind of recently, this is my wife, Emily. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman. She's a nurse. She's brilliant. She's a great mom. Like she's just fantastic. And she sent me a photo of herself a few weeks ago, because she had gone to get her hair done. And it's been a pandemic, and so apparently there was a lot of work that needed to be done to the hair. I guess that's how that goes. I don't fully understand what happens. It's all kind of mysterious to me. I just usually see the charge for it later and go, wow, how, what? And then she tells me don't worry about it. So she sent me a photo, and remember, my wife is very pretty, I think. I think my wife's very, very pretty, and it's important to name that before I show you the photo she sent me. So this is the photo that she sent me. And she sent it with the caption, "This is going to be expensive." So see, I saw that photo, and it reminded me of someone, and so I dropped it into Photoshop and sent her back this. This is Shredder from the Ninja Turtle movies. And I just thought, who wore it best? Obviously you do, dear. But yeah, so then I sent her that, and that didn't go great, me sending that photo back. And now I'm showing it to all of you, and that's a decision I made. So we'll see how that goes. So just a reminder, my wife is very pretty. Okay, so so every decision I've ever made, every decision I've ever participated, I've been there for that, right? Like every bad decision, I was there. I was the mastermind, and you were too. Think back about some of the things that you're kind of not so thrilled that you did. You were there for that. You pulled the trigger on that. That was your call. See, it turns out self-leadership is incredibly important, because the decisions we make right now very much impact the trajectory of our lives. The other thing is this. If you really want to influence other people, you have to be the kind of person that other people are influenced by. Now, you can influence someone to be the opposite of you. Probably a number of you have worked for people, and you learned a lot from that person. They influenced you. And what you learned was, if I'm ever in that position, I will never lead like that, right? But that's not a good influence. Probably the people that you've worked with or you've gotten to know or you've been friends with over the years, when you look at them and you think like, oh, that's a life well lived. That's someone I'd like to emulate. That's someone who has something to teach me about life. It's almost in every case, I guarantee you, someone who has led themselves well. You may have even worked with or been aware of people who are very successful in business. They may have made a lot of money and yet their lives were a train wreck and you thought, I don't want to live like that. Right? I love that they're able to buy that car or that home, but I don't want my marriage falling apart. I don't want my kids to stop talking to me. I don't want to get to 60, 70, 80 plus years old and feel like I don't have any friends or anyone who cares about me. Like, that's not a life worth living. So just because someone's successful doesn't mean that they're influential. And just because someone is financially not as successful doesn't mean they're not super influential. Like, if you've been influenced by someone who you admired, they've probably led themselves well. And so today, I think we got to talk about self-leadership. Because if we long to influence others well, we've got to lead ourselves well. So in John chapter 21, we're going to look at this story of Peter. I want to give you a little bit of background on who Peter is, because many of us may not know. Peter was one of the disciples of Jesus. So Jesus had these 12 people who followed him around and went where he went. And the goal of this 12 was just that they would learn to live like Jesus lived. They followed in the pathway of their rabbi, their teacher. And so within the 12, there's this like inner circle of 3. And so Peter's one of the 3. He's in the inner circle that Jesus has. And Peter's learned a ton from Jesus. But Peter is like my favorite character in the New Testament, probably, because I most relate personally to Peter. Peter's heart's in the right place, but Peter doesn't always like think before he talks, right? He blurts things out. He's like that friend. You probably all have that friend who's just a little bit too defensive of their friends, a little bit too loyal. You're like, oh yeah, somebody made this comment on my Facebook wall, and they're like, they did what? They said what? Let me at them. I'll put a post on your Facebook wall, right? Like, oh, they said that to you? Well, I'm going to need to give them 2 tickets to the gun show, right? Like they immediately just get all upset and cranky. You're like, hey, dial it down a little bit. That's Peter. He's the caffeinated disciple, okay? That's who he is. So he's constantly putting his foot in his mouth. And so Jesus tells him on the night that Jesus is about to be arrested and tried and crucified, he says, Peter, this is about to happen to me. And Peter's immediately like, no, that's not going to happen. And he says, not only that, but Peter, after I'm being arrested, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. You're going to refuse to admit to other people that you have anything to do with me. And Peter, of course, in his very Peter way, is like, oh, that'll never happen. Lord, even if everybody else forsakes you, I never will. Famous last words. Like, that's the direction he's headed here. So Jesus says, no, that's going to happen. So Jesus is arrested. He's tried. Peter, for the first time, sees the cost of discipleship. Up until this point, Jesus has been going. He's been teaching these amazing things. He's been gathering these crowds. And he's been performing miracles. And anytime one of his enemies feels threatened by him, right? Jesus is seen as a huge threat to both the Roman society, like the rule of law, and to the Jewish religious establishment. And so multiple times people try to capture him, stop him, prevent him from continuing to build this movement. And anytime that they try to do that, he just kind of slips away. He's just like, because it's not his time yet. And so his disciples get used to this, and it feels like as long as we stand with Jesus, like nothing bad's ever going to happen. And then the thing that Jesus said would happen, happens. He's arrested. He goes up and he confronts systems of power and oppression that are holding people down. And so, of course, they try to stop him. So Peter sees Jesus arrested, and he sees the trial happening. And he's trying to watch at a distance. And people are walking up to him, hey, weren't you with that man? It's like, no, I never knew him. No, I really think I saw you. You were like one of his followers, right? You've been everywhere with him. Nope, you're thinking of somebody else, man. I have one of those faces. Like, I get that a lot. It's not me. Someone else like, no, you're one of the disciples who follow. Like, we're one of the 12, right? Like, no. You're thinking of someone else. And the Gospels tell us that shortly after he denies involvement with Jesus for the 3rd time, the rooster crows, and he realizes what just happened. So Jesus is crucified. A little while later, he raises from the dead. The disciples, in the meantime, after he dies, they just feel defeated, destroyed. They're gathering in the upper room of a home, in secret to keep away because we might be next if people know where we are. Jesus raises from the dead and it fills them with this new hope and this new encouragement. They're like, oh my goodness, he did it. He really did it. If death can't stop him, what could possibly stop us? And they start to get a little bit courageous again. And shortly before Jesus gives his final address to his disciples that goes way beyond the 12, he has this conversation with Peter on a beach. He's made breakfast for all the remaining disciples, but then he just takes Peter aside and he talks to him. And this conversation ends up being critically important because Jesus has to do something for Peter in order for Peter to fulfill the role that he's supposed to fulfill. And so in John 21, we have one of my favorite stories in the Gospels. There are so many layers to it. We won't even be able to possibly address all of them this morning, but I really hope that you lean in and see what happens here. It's so fascinating. John 21, starting verse number 15. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? It's a weird question to just ask somebody out of the blue, right? You've just had a fish breakfast with everybody and your Lord who rose from the dead cooked you dinner on the beach. It was wow, that was very surprising. And then he just says do you love me? He's like, yeah, that fish was banging. I absolutely love you, Jesus. No, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Okay, so you're calling me to do something and you're giving me the reason why. I get that, okay. Jesus isn't done though. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. See, Jesus is doing something for him, but he still doesn't quite see what it is until verse 17. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? See, what's happening in this passage is not just that Peter's not just hurt because he's getting asked the same question as if Jesus doesn't believe him. Peter is hurt because when Jesus asks him the third time, he has a sudden realization as to what Jesus is doing. Peter denied him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And so Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. In asking him 3 times, Jesus is bringing up the past, the most painful, shameful incident of Peter's life. Jesus is bringing it right back up. This man who rose from the dead, we're getting the band back together is the feel that it has. All the disciples, he rose to what can stop us now? And then now Jesus is bringing up this thing that Peter would probably much rather forget. But Jesus basically tells him, you don't get to forget that. Do you love me? And that third time he gives him the opportunity to both confront the thing that happened, but also to be restored. If Jesus doesn't do this for him, Peter is living with the shame of that for the rest of his life. Do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. This story continues, and we're going to look at the rest of it as well, but I just want to take a time out here and there to just point out some of the pieces that Jesus is teaching Peter as he's walking him through this. Jesus is teaching Peter how to be a leader and an influencer because Peter has a very important part to play in the early church. And the first thing that Jesus teaches him is simply this: you have to be honest with yourself. You don't get to hide from the past. In fact, Pastor Andy Stanley says it this way: I will not lie to myself even when the truth makes me feel bad about myself. It's incredibly important. It would be much more comfortable to just pretend that the whole denial of you thing did not happen and just not to bring it up and let's just move forward. But the reality is it would be sitting in the back of your mind. You would always question whether you could be the leader that God had called you to be, because in your memory, when the stakes were high and the odds were bad, stacked against you, you dropped the ball. Like you refused to take ownership of your Lord. And so Peter desperately needs to be confronted with the truth of what he did, but he also needs to be restored. He needs to acknowledge the tragedy, but he needs to refuse to allow it to destroy the trajectory. Like, you were this, you need to own this. I'm giving you a way to be restored from this so that this does not hold you back anymore. And the truth is, if we want to lead ourselves well, if we want to influence others for the sake of the kingdom or for anything, Like, we have to be honest about where we really are. Because there are worse things than feeling bad about things not being in a good place. And deceiving ourselves is one of those things. Self-deception is very, very easy, and it happens all the time. It's the CEO that doesn't want to look at the quarterly financials because they know they're not good, and so they just kind of like put them aside, and we don't think about it. It's the person like who you're reviewing them, right? They don't want to do the employee review because they know they're going to have to hear hard things, and they just really want it to be light and fluffy. It's the supervisor who refuses to talk to the employee about the ways that they need to improve because they don't want to have a hard conversation, but improvement never happens because you're never honest about where things sit. It's the person in the marriage who realizes there's tension here between me and my spouse. And yet, because that would be hard to confront and acknowledge, like we just don't say anything and we just hope it will get better. We hope it drifts into healthy, but nothing ever drifts into healthy. Like if you don't name it, if you're not honest about the problem, you can't possibly find a solution. If you're not willing to own the actual place you are, even when it's painful or it makes us feel bad, then you can't get to a place that's better. And so part of self-leadership, Jesus teaches Peter, is to just acknowledge the thing that happened and then to determine that it won't happen again. It's to be restored from it, to get freedom from it, and to not have it define the way that you act going forward. Jeremiah says this in chapter 17. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Like, we don't like feeling bad about ourselves. So we deceive ourselves into thinking that things are actually better than they are. So you ask that question to yourself, right? Like, why did I make that financial decision? Why did I choose to put that on a credit card when I know I shouldn't have done that? Well, because the heart is deceitful. You end up selling yourself on you. You are the best. I worked at Magnolia Home Theater in Chicago for a number of years. And the best thing I could do, I was the top salesman month after month after month. How? Am I just so persuasive? Did I twist arms? No. I would put someone in front of an awesome TV and I would tell them to just watch it, and then I would help them picture themselves, and then they talked themselves into it because it looked amazing. Who doesn't want to see flowers blooming in 4K? Like, who doesn't want to see that? It's amazing. And so that, like, you sell yourself. We sell ourselves. By the way, I was younger then, and I wasn't thinking a lot about the debt I was forcing people into. So if you're like, that makes me uncomfortable, it makes me uncomfortable too, okay? So like that, but we sell ourselves. That's what I learned from that. We sell ourselves, and I sell myself on stuff. If I want something, even if it's ultimately not going to be great, if I want it in the moment, I can absolutely, almost every time, come up with 14 reasons that sound totally logical as to why we should do it today with no money down. It's easy. Why? Jeremiah knows. The heart is deceitful. Why did I call her? Why did I call my ex and possibly get back together when that relationship's been so unhealthy? Jeremiah knows. Your friends know too. The heart is deceitful. The heart is deceitful. That's why. And unless we're willing to own the truth of where things are, to tell ourselves the truth, even when the truth makes us feel bad about ourselves, like, it will be very hard to lead ourselves well, and therefore, it'll be difficult to influence others positively. Jesus goes on. Oh, this part's hard, guys. Very truly, I tell you, Jesus is speaking to Peter. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this, and it even goes on to say it. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, follow me. Jesus says, look, you got to confront the truth of where you are, but it can't hold you back. And so he restores him. He allows him to speak 3 times that he loves Jesus. He says, that's great. So I need you to follow after me. I want you to feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Peter, what you do is going to be so important. You're going to be a cornerstone, a building block of this church movement. And you've got to recognize the past and be honest about it to go forward, but you also have to know that there's going to be a cost, a price to pay. It's going to end up, Peter, costing you your life. And what we know about Peter historically is it seems like from the best accounts that we have that Peter was crucified upside down because he refused to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was. And so when he was older, someone else dressed him and they led him to a place where he did not want to go. And they crucified him for his faith. And he ended up influencing generation after generation after generation of followers of Jesus. In fact, every person here today, you are here in part because of what God used Peter to do. And it costs something. Why? Well, because Jesus tells us we got to be honest with ourselves, but Jesus also shows them that you got to realize that everything worthwhile is uphill. Everything worthwhile is uphill. If you talk to someone and you ask them like, hey, what were some formative moments in your life? What you're going to get back is stories of pain and stories of suffering and stories of complicated and stories of having to figure it out. Like, that's what you're going to get back. Where did you grow the most? What transformed you the most? No one says like, oh man, I got that lift kit for my Ford F-150 and I was like, I'm never going to be the same again. You know, like that's not the story that anyone tells. They may have great stories of vacation and trips and travels and good times. They may have stories like, oh, remember that time that we drank wine and snow? And like they have those great stories. Those are interesting stories. Those were down times. They were relaxing times. And those things are positive and good. It's good to relax. It's good to hang out. It's good to have an easy week. Like those things can be good. But the reality is, everything worthwhile is uphill. And so when they start to talk about what's actually been transformative, it's the stuff they had to work for. It's the stuff they had to run after. It's the stuff that costs them something. And Jesus is telling Peter, look, you're going to change. You're going to lead. You're going to influence, but it's going to cost you your life, Peter. Like it's all uphill. And this is why it's so hard to lead ourselves, by the way. Because for most of us, we're good with going uphill a couple of days, but we'd really like a week off after that. But the reality is, you can do away with a whole week of running uphill as hard as you can by taking the next week off completely. To really be changed, transformed, to really influence the people around us, we've got to be honest with ourselves. We've got to be willing to do the hard work of going uphill. And here's what I've learned about that. When you're in your 20s, you think that by the time you're in your 30s, you'll have it figured out. You have no idea what that means, but you figure by 30, you'll have that figured out too. So you think that at some point, right, I'm going to hit like an adult era where things are easier and everything comes naturally. And here's the reality. You will get to a place where lots of things that used to be hard are easy now. Yes. But if you stay there, you will not move forward and make progress. So now you need to take the next hill and do the next thing, which is not easy for you because you've never done it before. If you want to keep having influence, keep leading others, keep transforming, then you're always headed to the next place. It's never ending, but there's a beauty in that. Like it keeps staying hard. Why is it, do you think, that there are people who go to church almost every Sunday for their entire lives, and when they are older, they're 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, beyond, they don't look much like they don't look much different than anybody else in society. They're not more gracious. They're not more kind. They don't have thicker skin and more tender hearts. They don't exude the love of Jesus, but they showed up. They know the Bible inside and out. Why have they not transformed? Because transforming is hard. It's all uphill. It's fairly easy to show up on a Sunday morning. Now, I know there's lots to that too. There's kids, that you got to get packed up and you have to actually get out of bed before noon. Like there's a lot going on there. I get that. But compared to actual life transformation, showing up for a thing or a small group or whatever, that's not that hard comparatively. So people don't transform and they don't change because they don't want to do the hard thing. Life, everything worthwhile is uphill, but we have downhill habits. Like we're way more comfortable going downhill. It's really hard to change. And so it's why when you meet that person who's 60, 70, 80, 90 plus, and they exude joy even in the midst of suffering, and they exude confidence even when other people tear them down, and they exude grace and kindness even when people aren't gracious or kind to them, you just like stand there slack-jawed in awe, like, what is different about you? And what's different is that they didn't just learn information about faith, they actually worked to apply their faith to their lives. The challenge most of us have is not an information challenge. We don't just need to know more information about the Bible or about how to live. We actually need to do it. And doing it is hard because it's uphill. Just like everything worthwhile is uphill. Peter, you're going to have influence. You're going to change the world, but it's going to cost you because changing the world always has a cost. And Peter, for you specifically, that cost is going to end up being your life. This next part then of chapter 21, when I was in my mid-30s, I read it. I've read this story many times, but this next part just caught me in a way it hadn't before. and it just did something inside of me. And so I can't guarantee that it's going to for you, but man, I didn't realize the gravity of this. So I was in my mid-30s. Here's how it goes forward. So they're having this conversation, right? He just tells them it's going to cost you your life. You need to follow after me. So Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. By the way, this story is in the book of John. The disciple whom Jesus loved is John's very humble way of talking about himself. Okay, so John is behind them, and he's been, this was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" John was very much favored by Jesus, right? He's in the inner circle of three. And I got to think, like, just the way John talks about himself, he probably ended up being like the teacher's pet kind of person. Have you ever were you in school and you had like a teacher's pet in your class? You could probably name them if I asked you to. It was that person that seemed like, every time you were in class, like in seminary, I had a guy, his name is Aaron. Aaron, if you're watching this, you brought this on yourself. I'm sorry, bud. So, hope you're doing well. So Aaron was a smart guy. Aaron, I hope, has had a brilliant career since then. But everyone would be closing their laptops up and putting their things away, and it was time for the class to be over, and Aaron would be like, "I have a question." And everyone was like, "Ah!" Like, because we knew it wasn't necessarily a question. It was going to be like a speech with a question attached at the end that may or may not actually be a question. So he would go into it. And every class I had with Aaron, we were there 10 or 15 minutes later because Aaron always had a question at the end of the class. It's just like, Aaron, I'm not buying your lunch today, right? It was that kind of thing. In high school, it was Justin. Justin, I love you a lot. I think you're a really great guy. But man, teachers love you so much that the rest of us struggled to. That's kind of the reality there. But that was kind of the way that goes forward, right? Teacher's pet. You just kind of like, roll your eyes at them sometimes. John is that guy in the disciples. So Peter's just been told, I need you to make a difference in the world. Also, it's going to cost you your life. And then Peter turns around and he sees John. And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" What about him? Because if we're both going to die, this might all be worth it. Like, I don't love that guy. That's tough. He's a teacher's pet. What about him? Isn't that the question that we're always asking? We're always comparing. What about him? And I think the reason this question just like knocked me on my back when I was in my mid-30s is because I was getting to that place where I was very much comparing my career trajectory, my successes, my failures with other people who I'd graduated high school with or graduated college with or who were my age in my field. And like, I'm just looking at all that stuff and I'm like what about that person? Am I ahead of them? Am I behind them? Like, you just start playing this comparing game. And if you're not careful, what happens after a while is you start to determine where you should be based on where someone else is that may or may not be built like you at all. Because we each have a unique design and a unique call. And comparing ourselves to all these other people is not really very helpful. So Peter saw him and he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And then Jesus' reply almost takes your breath away. Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" Whew. In other words, Peter, John's path will not be your path. And you cannot let John's path change your path. You've been called. You've been created and designed in such a way. You have a very important role to play, but it's not the same role that John has. You are different. And he will reach people that you cannot reach, and you will reach people that he cannot reach. And that's exactly how I intended it to be. I remember it was around this time that I was struggling to come to grips with the fact that I cannot be equally helpful for everybody. There are certain people who I can be very helpful for, and there are other people that what I do and who I am and how I'm designed, it's just not for them. Like, I'm just not able to be helpful to them. And there's a hubris there, right? It's like, well, I ought to be able to be helpful to everybody. Everybody ought to like me. Everybody ought to like, but that's not the case. For instance, a few months ago, Celine Dion came out with a brand new album. Would you like to know what I think about Celine Dion's new album? I have no opinion about Celine Dion's new album. Why? It is not for me. Like Celine Dion does not have me or people who look like me or have musical interests like me in mind when she's creating that album. Also, she shouldn't. That would be weird. So she makes an album for the people who she can reach, and I am not one of those people. So my wife loves Celine Dion's new album, and I've only heard it in passing because we both have agreed there are certain things we're not going to make each other sit through while we drive in the car together, right? So I don't have a strong opinion about it. I'm sure it's great if that's the kind of thing that you're into. Celine Dion can't be equally helpful to everybody in the art and the craft that she's doing and that she's executing on. And here's the kicker. You can't either. So we start to compare ourselves to other people, and we start to find that we can't help everybody. And some people will reach more, but that doesn't make the people that we reach any less important. What is that to you, Jesus says? He answered, you must follow me. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? It doesn't change what you're called to do. You must follow me. You got to be honest with yourself. You got to realize that everything worthwhile is uphill, and you got to stop comparing yourselves to others. You have to. Because as long as you're doing that, you're not able to actually work on yourself. You're not able to actually live into the unique thing that you're called to do, that you've been designed to do. So this is what Jesus is inviting Peter to do. Stop worrying about John. John has a different thing he's called to. Worry about the thing that you're called to. That's what you can do that's the best. I talked to a clinical psychologist a while back, and one of the things they told me is that a lot of people come to them because there's something about themselves or about their life that they're unhappy with. And one of the things that he has to do then as a psychologist is to help them change some of those things so that they're more mentally healthy. He said, but a lot of times the reason that people fail to change the things that they are unhappy with in their lives is because they just bite off way more than they can possibly chew. So, for instance, you decide you want to lose weight, you know? Losing weight is a goal, and maybe you have an exact goal, and then it turns out like you're not able to achieve that goal, so someone asks you like, well, why did you fail? Like what was it you were trying to do? Well, first of all, I decided to cut my calories, and I decided to go down to 14 calories a day. I thought that would make it go by quickly. So I ate half of a package of salt every day. It was very delicious. And then I thought I should exercise too. So I started working out immediately, and I was like, I'm going to lift 4 hours a day. I'm going to run 6 hours a day. I'm never going to see my family again, but when they finally catch pictures of me on Instagram, I will be fit. Like, that was my plan. Well, I can't imagine why that didn't work out for you. You went from like couch potato to like Olympian in your mind. That was the trajectory. You were going to do that within a week. Well, that didn't work out. Why? You bit off way more than you could chew there. Right? So he says, people will come to me and they'll say that I'm lonely. So I'll say, okay, well, what can you do about that? And we brainstorm together what they can do. And so I'll tell them, well, why don't you go home then, right? And why don't you write out a profile for yourself that you would post on a dating website? Don't post it yet. Just bring it back next week and let's talk through it. And he says some people get so excited after they do it, they post it and they come back and then it's done. It's like, wow, you took a big step there. That was a big step that you took. And some people come back and they've written it out, but they haven't posted yet. And some people come back and they haven't written anything. He's like, well, why did they not write anything? Well, they still couldn't bring themselves to do even that. He said, so sometimes I'll just ask them, well, could you write one sentence of it in this session while we're here? And sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. He said, but the thing that it all has in common is you have to reduce the magnitude of the move forward until you hit the point where you'll actually do it. And he says, so the idea here is that there's something that you could do that would make you a little bit better. Not a lot better, not couch to Olympian. It would make you a little bit better. And you would do that thing, but you have to set a goal that's achievable. And once you hit a small goal, even if it's writing one sentence of a dating profile that you would put online, even if it's like, Josh, I want to read the Bible more. Great, what's your plan? I'm going to read through the Bible twice this year. Wow, well, how much did you read it last year? Not at all. That's a bad plan. You're going to crash and burn in Leviticus, I promise you. Like, you're not going to make it. So what can you do? Well, maybe this year the goal is I'm going to read a chapter a week, or I'm going to have a verse that I memorize every month. Like, just what can you do to reduce the magnitude of the move forward until you hit the point where you'll actually do it? And this is the thing. If you're comparing yourself to others, you will not be able to do this because they will be, right, so far ahead of you in whatever way that you're comparing that a little move that you might make that gets you closer to what you've been called to do will look trivial compared to what they're doing. So stop comparing yourself to others. Compare yourself today to who you were yesterday. Way better. Have I taken a little bit of a step forward? If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's it to you? Follow me. We can't compare our paths. You're built differently. You've got a different calling in your life than the people around you. And just wanting your life to mirror somebody else's is not only uncreative, it's not actually what you've been designed to be. It's not what you've been called to do. It's not their people are not the people you've been called to reach. Reduce the magnitude of the move forward until you hit the point where you'll actually do it. Here's the idea. I mean, honestly, if you want to influence other people, if you want to be a leader to other people, if you want to take, and if you're a follower of Jesus, like this should be really important to you, because one of the last things he gives the church as a task is to go into the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything he commands. It's a pretty big charge. None of us can do it on our own, but we're called to do it collectively. And so if you're a follower of Jesus, then one of the things that you are to be doing is influencing the world around you with the gospel that's in your heart. And the reality is we won't influence if we don't work toward becoming the kinds of people who are influencers. In the end, you are the only one who can lead you. That's it. Yeah, but, I've got these other people pouring into me. Yeah, but you decide whether to let them or not. Yeah, but God wants to use me and change me. Absolutely he does. But you have to decide whether you will allow the Spirit to work in your life or not. You are the only one who can lead you. And if you don't make the decision to do that, no one else can make it for you. If we want to influence others, if we want to lead others, we have to lead ourselves first. A few weeks ago, a staff member here at IHC came into my office, and we had been talking as a staff about evangelism. What does it look like for us to help the community that we live in hear the gospel of Jesus Christ? Like, what does that look like? And they brought this book in, and they read me a passage from this book. And this passage was brilliant, and this book is brilliant. And they said, I think this is one of the best books on evangelism I've ever read. And I agreed with them, because I've read that book as well. And I said, that is one of the best books on evangelism I've ever read. And then this staff member said, it's a shame that the author is who the author is, because we can't use it. And he's right, we can't. This book was written by one of the most influential pastors in the United States in the 20th and the 21st centuries. Church is different in the U.S. today because of this pastor's influence. As this pastor was nearing retirement, we're talking months away, he was getting ready to be celebrated by his congregation, celebrated by Christians all over the U.S. Well done, good and faithful servant is the pronouncement that was about to be made. And then we found out that for as smart as he was, and as well as he had developed others, he had not led himself well. And he had engaged in inappropriate sexual relationships with some other people, and he had made people uncomfortable with some of the things he had said to them that had a sexual tinge to it. And then he denied it and lied about it. And then more people came forward. And then he was finally forced to resign and to leave. And the church was super apologetic that they didn't listen to the people who came forward first and just kind of blew them off. Like it was a tragedy that happened just a few years ago. And the reality is this guy wrote some brilliant things that would be great to quote and great to have people look at. And I wish I could recommend his books, but I can't. Why? Because he didn't lead himself well. Ultimately, he flamed out. And a story that should have ended in triumph actually ended in tragedy. You're like, well, Josh, if he said some good things, like we could still look at that, right? No. Well, Josh, like people can do bad things and still have smart things to say. They absolutely can. We're just not going to use them here, because I don't want to lead anyone to think that it's okay to move in that direction, to be like that guy, because the fruit of his actual life, not okay. And that ought to break your heart. It breaks mine, because his life should have been used for so much more. And now he's going to be blotted out of the history books, and he should be. That's tragic. But it's not the way it has to be for you. Your life is a story that is still being written, but for which you hold the pen. And you have the opportunity now to choose a different path than that. You have the opportunity now to choose a path that essentially says, you know what, I'm gonna own the reality of the now. I'm gonna name what's true now so that it might be changed and not be true later. You have the opportunity to choose a path that says, you know what, it's the hard path. It's all uphill because it's worthwhile, and I'm gonna keep pursuing it and running after it for my sake and for the sake of others. You have the opportunity to choose a path that says, I'm not gonna compare myself to everybody else because God has designed me uniquely and called me uniquely. And the thing I care about is, how do I compare today to who I was yesterday? And is God moving me and transforming me forward? Because that's the way that will influence others, and that's the opportunity you have to transform your world. That's the brilliance of it. And that's what Jesus teaches Peter, and that's what he teaches us, and that's what he calls us to. So we're gonna stand together now, and we're gonna worship, and we're gonna be the kinds of people who wanna give away the things that God is doing in our lives so that the world may be a more beautiful place.